Okay, I want to welcome to the program Jon Marshall, associate professor at the Medill. I'm not sure I'm saying that pronouncing that correctly.
Right.
School of Journalism at Northwestern University, is author of Clash: Presidents and the Press in Times of Crisis. Jon, welcome to the show. I'm here with Emma Vigeland.
Hello, Sam, and hello, Emma. Thank you for having me on the show. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
100%.
So I want to start because you basically hit some the book is a sort of a history of a history of the relationship between the press and the presidency, but particularly sort of I guess watershed relationships over the course of American history that brought us to where we are today with this relationship. So let's sort of reverse engineer this. Where are we today in terms of this dynamic between the presidency and the press?
Oh, I think we are in troubled times in terms of that dynamic, but it's not the first time we've been in troubled times in terms of that dynamic. And I'm sure your listeners are well aware of a lot of the problems that we face today in terms of how the media covers the presidency and how presidents in recent years, particularly Donald Trump, have attacked journalists. But it's not the first time. And my book starts with John Adams in the 1790s and his attack on newspaper writers and editors of the day with the Sedition Act, when more than 100 people were prosecuted for daring to say or write something that was critical of the government or critical of the press. And the Federalists in power, including John Adams, and they controlled Congress and they controlled the courts, went after anybody who was critical of the president and the government, and it ended up as a result shutting down newspapers and curbing free speech and a free press. But in the end, it came back to bite John Adams because he lost the election to Thomas Jefferson, and one of the reasons was because of the popular distaste for his Sedition Act.
All right. Well, then let's let's jump to one of the next big moments that develops this is Abraham Lincoln. And that's a big jump. Why does it? Where is the lineage between what happens with Adams and with Lincoln, or how do we see this in the context of the development of a relationship?
Right. So I decided I wasn't going to try to cover every president, because that could be an extremely long book. So I picked 10 of them whose presidencies I think really reflected some key moments in terms of that dynamic. And sort of the through line between John Adams, we just talked about, tried to suppress the press. Lincoln, in probably the time of our nation's greatest crisis, the Civil War, the Union military, as well as the Confederacy, did try to restrict the press as well and limit their coverage of what was going on in the war. But what I really focus on in the Lincoln chapter is the power of the press to influence a president. Lincoln wasn't an abolitionist to start with. He was anti-slavery, but he wasn't in favor of abolishing slavery where it already existed. But through the abolitionist press, which started as a very small segment of the press at that time and was considered a fringe radical group for much of the early 1800s, gradually grew more influence, grew more readers. Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon, subscribed to abolitionist newspapers, would read them to him. And once Lincoln became president, he actually invited abolitionist editors and leaders such as Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, to talk with him in the White House. And through their pressure, their influence in the Republican Party, he needed them to win re-election in 1864. Lincoln's moral compass of being opposed to slavery began to gradually align with his political and his strategic compass of wanting to win the war and win re-election. And the abolitionist press was part of the reason he did that. Through their pressure, through talking to him, they got him to support the Emancipation Proclamation and then to support the 13th Amendment.
What's the calculus that is used when a president is pushed by the press? I mean, I think like on some level, from my perspective, we have that this also applies to really to the leadership of the parties. And, we see, I don't know if you can see Republicans responding to, let's say, like Fox News as much as working in tandem, right? I mean, it doesn't even seem to be necessarily enough daylight between them. But certainly you see like the Democratic leadership respond to what seems to be an increasingly insignificant circle of media, the Sunday talk shows and maybe a couple of other shows. But where does when the abolitionist press comes and tries to convince Lincoln that he should be more aggressive in rolling back slavery, what's the leverage? Is it that he's worried that, is it that he thinks they represent a perspective, or he thinks that they will undercut his support amongst their readers?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think the answer is yes to both. Lincoln and smart politicians in other eras understand that the press, however it exists in their era, then it was mostly newspapers, some magazines in Lincoln's day, a few pamphlets. Now, obviously, it's everything from social media to television to radio to print and everything else that's online, podcasts like yours. So a smart politician, especially a president, is going to understand that that media can influence their listeners, their audience, to support or support them in their policies or go against them and their policies. And you mentioned Fox News a few moments ago in connection with the Republican Party. And I talk quite a bit about that in my book, how the Republican Party really began to merge with right-wing media starting really during the George W. Bush administration, and almost really became one and the same in some respects. We know about the revolving door between the Trump administration and Fox News. We know that when right-wing talk radio hosts went after a bipartisan immigration effort during the Bush administration, and then later the Obama administration, and got their listeners to oppose it, that then the Republican politicians who are afraid of being called rhinos, Republicans in name only, backed off. So that gets to your question, that smart politicians like Lincoln can recognize the power of the media to influence the electorate, influence people who might be their supporters, influence people who might come out against them.
So it's almost like maybe not so veiled threat in some instances, right? I mean, it's much easier to see it for me, on the right than with Republicans than Democrats, like contemporaneously, because there isn't the same media infrastructure on the center to center left. And it's just not as, and in some ways they act as like a buffer. They're far less representative, it seems to me, of the Democratic voter than Fox is and talk radio is of the Republican voter. But let's come to that in a bit, because I want to jump to from the 1860s when Lincoln made that shift to the 1917 with Woodrow Wilson. They used, or the administration used, I guess, fairly recent legislation as a way of prosecuting journalists. This is in the context of World War I. Give us a sense of like why Woodrow Wilson?
Wilson came into office as a great proponent that presidents should work with the press to further the interest of the nation. But Wilson did not have the personality to do that successfully. He'd been president of Princeton and a longtime professor, and he tended to lecture the press as if they were dim-witted students rather than people serving a important role in a democracy. He was first to hold press conferences, but they went terribly because of his sort of stern approach to journalists, and he wanted them to be more stenographers. And anytime they asked a challenging question, he would bristle and shut it down. So he had a very tense relationship with journalists to begin with. Then when World War I started, the United States entered World War I, I should say, he was very much in favor of cracking down on any kind of dissent, whether it was in the press or free speech. And he and his congressional allies passed and signed three really draconian laws. One was the Trading with the Enemies Act, one was the Espionage Act, and the third was another version of the Sedition Act, going back to what John Adams did. And they were so severe that there was a gentleman in Washington who wrote a book saying war is wrong. He was prosecuted and put into jail. There was a Reverend Clarence Waldron wrote that Christians should not fight. He was arrested and put in jail. The Masses, which was a sort of liberal progressive newspaper of its day, had some critical cartoons and articles about the war effort. Their cartoonist and several of their journalists were prosecuted. The whole publication had to shut down as a result. And there's a real climate of fear. There were vigilantes going around cities and towns across the United States looking for people who might oppose the war effort, might oppose the draft, and cracking down on them. There was a socialist newspaper in Milwaukee, The Leader, that was actually published by a congressman. He was a socialist who had been elected to Congress, Victor Berger, and the Postal Service basically shut it down. And Victor Berger was arrested for violating the Espionage Act because he thought that the corporations were profiting too much from war, and he wrote about that. So he went to jail and was finally released on a technicality. So it was a real period of suppression, and it shows the danger of a president who has too much power. And it's really during times of war that we often see that, although during Trump's administration, we certainly saw a president who tried to do the same thing.
What was the, how was there a rollback from that? I mean, was it just at the end of the war? Did those, and I feel like even under the Obama administration, we saw some of the return of the Espionage Act deployed against the press in this country.
Yeah, Obama, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, but that was, at the time as this was happening, I remember we were saying, like, this hasn't been used in 100 years. And it was Wilson who had used it. How did the ramp down happen? How do you unwind that?
Right. Yeah, you're exactly right. Obama dusted off the Espionage Act from 1917, and he used it more often against, or his administration, I should say, used it more often against leakers than all other presidents combined before him. So how did it roll back? You're right. It was largely the end of the war. No longer that great climate of fear that the United States was in this life and death struggle for democracy, although we could question whether it was really for democracy. And it was also partly because Wilson went so far with it and had bred so much mistrust with the press that when he wanted to get the Senate to pass the League of Nations, Wilson spent a number of months in Paris negotiating with the French and the British over the terms of the German surrender and what the peace would look like afterwards. But he really shut off the press from what those discussions entailed. And the reporters who were there, and there were many reporters covering it, it was a big story of the day, but the reporters who were there were shut out from what Wilson was thinking, what his administration was trying to do in terms of forming Wilson's great dream, which was the League of Nations. So in the void of information from Wilson, the Republicans who opposed Wilson were quite willing to fill that void with their arguments against the League of Nations. And by the time Wilson returned to the United States, public opinion had already mounted against the League of Nations, against Wilson's big grand vision, and he was never able to get it through the Senate, and partly due to his own fault in not really using the press to promote his ideas.
I have a little theory about that. That is that he had that flu, and he was losing his mind. But I don't know if that was, I mean, there's some people who have
yeah, there's a debate among historians. Did he have the Spanish flu, which might have done that? Others say he just had some strokes and that he had deteriorated. But Wilson's disdain for the press was long before that as well. Right. So it was only intensifying a habit he already had.
Let's skip to Trump, because I want to get a sense of, like, where we are at today. I mean, you started this talk by saying we were in trouble, but like, what does that really mean, and what are the things that are sort of, I mean, I think the dusting off the Espionage Act on journalists who are getting leaked information, which I think at the time, but certainly in hindsight, could not be construed as espionage. I mean, I don't think it should have been at the time, but it's also sort of like these leaks were not so damaging that you could even argue, never mind the dynamic of espionage, you can't even argue the implications of espionage, right? There's no damages here, as far as
right, yeah. Sort of espionage, as we tend to think of it, is like you're giving the information to the enemy.
I mean, there has to be some, and that the information is like would be problematic if given to the enemy, and
Exactly.
none of that seems to have been the case. But let's talk about like that relationship with Trump. But I'm also curious from the end of from the side of the press side. Like it's a radically different press today than, say, 20 years ago, because of technology and both social media and the what's happened to the news business.
Oh, it's definitely true. So now any of us can really be our own publisher, our own podcaster, or social media influencer. So rather than the president dealing with a few dozen journalists in the White House press corps who might be covering them, now there's literally probably tens of thousands of people who are writing or broadcasting things on a daily basis about the president. So it's much harder for president to control what the press is doing, although easier for a president to reach the public directly through their own social media channels. But where I think we're really in the most danger, Sam, is I would say in two ways. One is the degree of hostility towards a free press that we see today, certainly heightened during the Trump era, but still continuing, especially among some circles in the Republican Party, but also among people on the left and Democrats as well. This great hostility towards the press, which the press should be checked, the press should be criticized, but the fundamental role of a press in a democracy should not be ignored. And we see what happens in dictatorships is the first thing they try to do is clamp down on the media, clamp down on journalism. And we're in a real danger point, I think, in terms of the media outlets that do try to present verified factual information are ignored because of that hostility. And the people who scream the loudest and exaggerate the most and trade in the biggest conspiracy theories are the ones who are getting the clicks and the likes and are spreading a lot of dangerous information. I think that's one thing. The other big danger, and we can talk in more detail about it if you want, is the decline in local news. We've got more than 1,000 communities now that have no local news outlet. And this is the bread and butter of people's daily existence. What their local taxes are their streets getting paved? What's going on with police and fire and so forth? And a lot of studies show that corruption increases when there's not local news coverage. Taxes increase when there's not good local news coverage, and the perspective of communities around the country, I think, is lost, and we tend to also end up with the big media in Washington, the big media in New York, presenting their perspective on things, and we're losing the perspective of what's going on in towns across America as a result.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge thing, and I think it's warrants it's probably its own show, frankly, the demise of the local. But let me ask you this, just in terms of like that first part that you said, like the tremendous amount of sources of information, much of which is inaccurate, sometimes purposely so, and sometimes not. The Biden administration tried to, and they just, as of today, abandoned, it appears, to create some. It's really unclear to me what it is. I mean, frankly, and I've tried to read about what it is, but I'm trying to think of what they specifically called. It was a board created in the DHS, the Disinformation Governance Board. And the board, according to them, was created to study best practices in combating the harmful effects of disinformation and to help DHS counter viral lies and propaganda that could threaten domestic security. I don't know what that means. I mean, I know what all the words mean, and I can take little phrases and understand, but I don't study best practices in combating, what are they actually going to do? It was unclear, I think. And there was a lot of pushback. A lot of it was, sort of, I think, bad faith pushback. But on the other hand, I don't read this and feel good about it. That this board is going to do something good. Talk to us to the extent that you know about that board, and what your sense is. If that is not the solution, what is the solution?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there. It was hard to understand what the board was going to do and exactly what problem it was trying to address. And I think the intent of creating the board might have been a good idea, and there's certainly a strong need for it. But I think the Biden administration didn't do the groundwork necessary to explain why it was creating the board, just exactly what the problem the board was going to address was, and really making a case to the public about why it was needed before the blowback started. Because as we all know, there's a huge problem with disinformation. Example, in April 2020, the early days of COVID, the Facebook post from the top 10 health sites was 70 million. And the Facebook post got 70 million views. The Facebook post from the top 10 conspiracy COVID sites got 300 million views, more than 4 times as much. So there's a real danger from disinformation, and that disinformation kind of played out through the COVID crisis. I think trying to do it through a government agency may not be the right way to do it. I think there could be changes in what's known as Section 230 of the Telecommunications Act. You're probably familiar with that, where the social media tech companies have no liability for disinformation that they spread, no liability if they are spreading libelous information. In the same way, any newspaper that's publishing something that's libelous faces a lawsuit for it. Any broadcast station faces a lawsuit for that. But the social media companies at this point bear no responsibility for that in terms of the law. I think that's something that could be tightened if the social media companies don't do it themselves, which I think would probably be the best ways if they took it upon themselves to really seriously take on disinformation. But if they don't, Congress could certainly act and do it that way.
Yeah, I frankly am for a tightening of 230. I think you can do that by basically saying, if you have this many impressions per month or per year, you have a higher level of responsibility. I mean, frankly, I'm not going to. I don't think it's reasonable for us to manage the comments at the Majority Report site, frankly. But I think when you start talking about 30 million views or 300 million views, you have a different level of responsibility.
Right.
I think for these things.
And a lot of it, Sam, is also being transparent about what their algorithms do, because as we've learned from some of the leaks from Facebook, is the algorithms were programmed to reward the most controversial things, right. The most disingenuous things, and that got us partly to where we are today. The European Union has passed things to force Google and Facebook and others to be more transparent about exactly what their algorithms are rewarding. And I think that would be another way to get at it, is if they're not more transparent, tighten that Section 230.
I'm completely down with that. The book is Clash, Presidents and the Press in Times of Crisis by Jon Marshall. We will put a link to that at majority.fm. Much appreciated for your time today.
Sam and Emma, thank you for having me on. It's been great.
Thanks so much.